I remember hearing of flour sack dresses ever since my youth in the 1950s. But a while back, I discovered through rummaging on the internet that my concept of what that term meant was totally in error. I don't even remember when I first heard the term, and I'm suspicious that rather than flour sack, what I heard originally was gunny sack dress. I knew that a gunny sack was a tan sack made out of burlap, a thick, scratchy material with a big, open weave. You might expect it to carry a supply of bulky items like potatoes. The term gunny sack dress conjured in my mind the hillbilly world of Lil Abner, with barefooted poor folks like Daisy May in tattered clothes made out of scraps of material patched together. Gunny sacks seemed to me to be what hillbillies would tote their personal stuff around in. In the 1958 rock and roll song Johnny B. Good, Chuck Berry sang that country boy Johnny, who lived in a cabin in the woods near New Orleans, carried his guitar in a gunny sack. And I envisioned that Johnny got that sack after it was emptied of the potatoes that came in it from the general store. So when I heard about gunny sack dresses, I pictured this. I was kind of surprised when looking for photos to use for this video that it wasn't just the girl next door, like this cheerful young woman, who could pose in that kind of gunny sack in the 1950s. Yes, that's glamorous Hollywood star Marilyn Monroe, sporting the latest fashion in potato sacks in 1951. Marilyn posed for a series of high-fashion photographs wearing a potato sack as a cheeky response to a journalist who said she might look sexier in a burlap sack than in her usual fashion choices. As it turns out, in case you were wondering, the word gunny in this situation doesn't have anything to do with guns. It is an anglicized version of a word from India pronounced gunny, spelled G-U-N-I, that means the same thing that burlap means, the rough, open weave material that Marilyn's dress here is made of. Burlap is woven from the coarse fibers typically processed from the big, stiff leaves of the sisal plant, or from the sturdy stems of the jute plant. Rope and twine are also typically made from such sisal or jute fibers. I've noticed in recent years that cat scratching posts, scratching mats, and scratching toys are now typically wrapped in sisal roping. Cats seem to love to sharpen their claws on the rough texture of the sisal. Since burlap fabric is made from the same type of rough fibers, it is much more rough and scratchy, like that scratching post rope, than like the soft and fluffy fibers of cotton bolls that are turned into the various kinds of smooth cotton fabrics. In my youth, gunny sacks often played a part in humorous stories. When I recently asked my daughter, Mona, born in 1970, if she'd ever heard of flour sack dresses, she also immediately connected the idea with burlap sacks and had only one memory connected to the term. A big I Love Lucy rerun fan in her childhood, she remembered a 1956 episode where Lucy and Ethel wore gunny sack dresses. I was surprised to find a whole description of that 1956 episode on a Lucy fan website as I was doing research for this video. Here's what happened in that episode during a trip by Lucy and Ricky Ricardo and Fred and Ethel Mertz to visit Paris. After going to a fashion show of all the new chic Parisian styles, Lucy makes up her mind that she wants a dress by famous Paris dress designer Jacques Marcel. But the year before, Lucy had talked Desi into buying her an expensive dress by a famous Hollywood designer named Don Loper. And she wrote out a promise at that time that she would never ask him to buy another expensive dress. When she nags for a new Parisian dress, Ricky pulls out her written promise. But Lucy goes back on that promise and nags him for a Marcel dress. When Desi refuses, she stubbornly vows to go on a hunger strike until Ricky agrees to buy her a dress. By the third day of the hunger strike, Lucy looked so gaunt and weak that Ricky is losing his resolve. He tries to force her to eat something, but Lucy refuses to break her vow. When Ricky leaves all upset, Lucy rushes to make a sandwich out of food that she has hidden throughout the hotel room. Ethel is Lucy's food supplier, and she asks Lucy what to sneak in for dinner that night. Lucy asks for a roast chicken. Ethel brings the chicken, and Lucy hides it in a camera bag. Ricky returns with a very nice surprise. He bought Lucy a Jacques Marcel dress because he can't stand to see her starve. When Ricky goes to take a picture of Lucy in the new dress, he finds the roast chicken in the camera bag and realizes Lucy has been faking the hunger strike all along. He takes the dress to return it to the dress shop. To trick their wives as a way to get back at them for the phony hunger strike, Ricky suggests that he and Fred have dresses made out of real burlap potato sacks that have phony Jacques Marcel labels sewn in them for their wives to wear. They also plan to make Lucy a hat out of a horse's feed bag and Ethel a hat out of an empty champagne bucket. Ricky and Fred proudly present the ugly outfits, and while Lucy and Ethel are puzzled by their strangeness, they still believe they are ultra-modern, quirky Paris originals, and they proudly wear them out to lunch at a cafe. Everyone at the cafe is staring at Lucy and Ethel's bold fashion choice, including designer Jacques Marcel, who is present at the cafe. Soon, Ricky and Fred can't keep from laughing and reveal the truth. Lucy and Ethel are beyond humiliated, and they cover themselves with a tablecloth as they flounce off back to the hotel. Later, Ricky and Fred have apologized for pulling such a stunt. As part of the makeup agreement, Ricky must buy a Jacques Marcel dress for Lucy and pay for half of Ethel's dress that Fred has to buy. On the way to the dress shop, the foursome stop to eat at the same cafe. They can't believe their eyes when they see some of Jacques Marcel's models wearing copies of their burlap creations. Ricky and Fred say the girls don't need new dresses now because they have the originals of what is now a fashion statement. But Lucy and Ethel admit that they burned the burlap dresses as soon as they could. An interesting bit of trivia about the end of the episode. One of the models that walks through the cafe in burlap, wearing a champagne bucket on her head, shown here with Lucy, is actually Georgia Holt, mother of superstar singer Cher. Cher would have been 9 years old at the time of the filming of this Lucy episode. Here are mother and daughter together in 2010 when Cher was 64 and Georgia was 84. Georgia had a long career as a singer, songwriter, actress, and model. She's still alive at 96 in 2022. I didn't remember that old Lucy episode at all, but I guess lots of other folks have fond memories of it, for there are cutesy, collectible little dolls representing Lucy and Ethel in their fake burlap Paris gowns available right now for purchase. And even a Lucy Barbie-sized doll in full burlap costume. But back to gunny sacks now. The one other thing I remembered about gunny sacks was that they are what has been stereotypically used for the iconic sack race that has been a staple of group recreation events for over a century. I don't know if folks still try to find them to use for such races, but they were still typical in the 1970s, as you can see from this 1972 episode from The Brady Bunch. Since I had connected the concept of flour sack dresses with gunny sacks over the years, I couldn't imagine that anyone, even hillbillies like Lil Abner's Daisy May, really wanted to wear such fashions, as they sounded scratchy and miserable to me. I recently found out that I was totally misled in my assumptions. Back before most people bought their bread in sliced loaves packaged in cellophane at the grocery, the average housewife went through a whole lot of flour every month baking bread to serve at almost every meal, and they would buy the flour in bulk. Prior to the mid-1800s, flour and other bulk commodities such as chicken feed was typically sold in bulk in barrels. But starting in the mid-1800s, as cotton prices fell, making mass production of cotton goods highly profitable, the industry began shifting to distributing these goods in sturdy cotton sacks. Yes, many farm goods were still distributed in burlap gunny sacks, but those would have been the bulkier items like potatoes. The finer weave of the cotton bags was more suitable for flour and animal feed. And thus, by the late 1800s, many families, particularly rural farm families, would easily accumulate numerous large empty flour and feed sacks throughout the year. It didn't take long for thrifty, creative farm wives to realize that these sacks could be recycled or repurposed to craft all sorts of items. By the turn of the century, and for many years later, it was typical for such women to regularly turn their family's used cotton flour and feed sacks into diapers for their babies, underwear for older children and adults, dish towels for their kitchens, quilts for their beds, and more. This photo from 1939 shows an industrious woman in Alabama who had decorated practically her whole home, including chair covers, bedspread, drapes, and more made from flour or feed sacks. Each 100-pound bag would yield over a square yard of usable fabric. Unlike the rough, open weave and burlap sacks, the cotton sacks were much higher quality. In order to be sturdy enough to contain flour and feed without leaking or tearing, these sacks were made of tightly woven cotton material, similar in quality to what is referred to as percale today. By the 1920s, the flour and feed container industry was beginning to catch on to the fact that their cotton packaging was having a second life as clothes and household accessories. To take advantage of this trend and turn it to their own good, some sack manufacturers began printing cheerful, checked, and striped patterns in various bright colors on their bags. Sure enough, many buyers began preferring the brands packed in this new sewing material, and it proved profitable. The sack companies went on to build on this advantage by eventually making their high-quality, closely woven cotton sacks available in a wide variety of pretty printed patterns. The printing process was also of such high quality that the colors stayed bright even through many washings. The flour and feed companies were even careful to print their own logo on the sacks in water-soluble ink that would wash out quite easily, while the pretty patterns remained bright and clear. The housewife would remove the stitching holding the sides of the sack together, wash out the company logo, and starch and iron the material to make it smooth for sewing. Some companies later used a paper band around the sack to display the logo, so the housewife could even skip the step of washing out the logo. What happened next is described well in a fascinating article published by the Textile Society of America and presented at a major symposium of their organization in 2012. It's titled From Feed Sack to Clothes Rack: The Use of Commodity Textile Bags in American Households from 1890 to 1960. Here is some interesting material from that article. Once the fabric was prepared, there was very little difference between a length of feed sack dress percale and a length of dress percale purchased in a store as a new yard good. The Percy Kent Bag Company hired top textile designers from Europe and New York City to create stylish prints with color-fast dyes. In 1927, 3 yards of dress print cotton percale, the typical amount of fabric needed for an average-size adult dress, could cost 60 cents when purchased from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Factoring in inflation over the years since then, that would be the equivalent in buying power of $10 today. 3 yards of gingham dress goods could cost 40 cents. In comparison, 3 yards of dress quality gingham used in Gingham Girl flour sacks from the George P. Plant Milling Company could be salvaged after the use of 2 or 3 100-pound bags of flour. The same would be true of sacks of chicken feed. I assume it would take even a large farm family well over a month to eat up 300 pounds of flour, even if they ate several loaves of bread a day. But those who were chicken farmers would accumulate feed bags a lot more quickly. A farmer's wife described their family's commodity bag usage in the book Feed Sack Fashion. We had 2 big chicken houses and used 14 sacks of feed every week. My husband got most of the sacks. He always tried to get 2 or 3 of the same pattern so we would have enough to make something. He did a pretty good job of picking them out. That wife may never quite understood the effort it took to meet her sewing needs. Feed sacks may have looked like dress fabric, but they were stacked in big piles in feed stores with little fanfare. And at first, employees were surprised by requests to move several 100-pound bags of chicken feed to get to the perfect dress pattern. One man remembered trips to the feed store as a teenager when it was important to run this errand with several friends because his mother preferred patterns would always be on the bottom, so his and his buddies would have to hoist sacks until they secured the patterns his mother wanted. As you might guess, all of this was good for the manufacturers of feed sacks, at least the ones who made the prettiest patterns, but not quite so popular among the feed store owners and workers. Feed companies began to notice that while a husband may have little preference in the brand of egg mash fed to his chickens, his wife needed a specific pattern to match a feed bag that she already owned. Her husband began to demonstrate a preference. Suddenly, feed companies were being encouraged to use the latest dress print bags, and feed supply stores were turned into fabric stores, to the disdain of one feed salesman interviewed in 1948 who said, "Years ago they used to ask for all sorts of feeds, special brands, you know. Now they come over and ask me if I have an egg mash and a floured percale. It ain't natural." Early on, when I was reading up on flour and feed sack clothing, I was still under a misconception. Most of what I read implied that it was a phenomenon that was particularly centered around the needs of poor families during the Great Depression, from 1930 through the beginning of World War II. This would make a lot of sense. Moms, like the one in this photo, in a family just scraping by with many mouths to feed, would be the most likely to really care about having to spend 60 cents for the cloth to make a dress for herself or clothes for her children. But she would be very happy to get pretty material for free with her family's flour and chicken feed purchases. But I soon discovered this was only one aspect of the appeal of the sacks. As I learned later, the practice spread from poorer families up into the middle class during World War II. Not so much just because of the savings for the family budget, but for the savings for the war effort. It was considered downright patriotic to sew fashions for your family with sackcloth. Regular textiles used by home seamstresses were rationed during the war, but the feed and flour sacks were classified as industrial textile products and thus were not subject to the rationing. The From Feed Sack to Clothes Rack article from 2012 put it this way. When the country went to war in the 1940s, domestic fabric production was put on hold while textile companies created goods for use for the military. Textile rationing during World War II did not originally apply to feed sacks, which were classified as industrial textile products. During the height of war production restrictions, hundreds of colorful dress prints were available at the rural feed store, providing a wider variety of patterns than any store carrying traditional yard goods at the time. Cotton bag sewing was both a frugal move and a patriotic one. A newspaper column from May 1944 explained, Best of all is the patriotic spirit you show when you salvage fabrics. The housewife who converts cotton bags into the many useful items they are capable of becoming under the magic of willing hands and minds not only serves herself, but conserves essential fabrics for her country. The Textile Bag Manufacturers Association proclaimed, "A yard saved was a yard gained for victory." In 1943, the United States War Production Board standardized bag sizes into 6 types ranging from 2 to 100 pounds in an effort to reduce waste. The Production Board approved pattern books for release to the home front. One mother made her young daughter's entire wardrobe from feed sacks during the war. The war effort took all the fabric on the market, she told an interviewer. You could buy very little printed fabric. Some researchers estimate that over 3.5 million women and children were wearing flour and feed sack fashions during World War II. Here's a look at just a tiny few of the many sack prints that were available and the variety of garments that were made from them by industrious amateur seamstresses. Some were good for baby clothes and accessories, like these sunbonnets. Some were good for little boys' shirts. Some were cute patterns for little girls' clothes. And a huge number were appropriate for dresses for older girls and women. Some bag companies even produced specialty bags that had make-your-own stuffed dolls printed on the material, such as this one, ready for mom to cut out and turn into a cute stuffed bunny. Others occasionally provided bag material with outlines printed on them suitable for embroidering. And there were themed variety prints particularly suitable for such things as dish towels and placemats. But the beginning of the end of flour sack fashions came soon after the end of World War II and the end of textile rationing. The availability of yard goods began to improve for rural shoppers during the spring of 1945. After the war, one child accompanied her mother to a department store that was fully stocked to pre-war levels and pointed to bolts of traditional yard goods in the window. "Oh, Mom, look at those pretty feed sacks." By the early 1950s, popularity of the dress print bag began to fade. Traditional yard goods were becoming more accessible all over the country, and the rural lifestyle that enabled families to use dozens of 100-pound chicken feed sacks in a year began to disappear. The cotton industry began to lose some of their most lucrative customers as bag companies began to make the switch to the multi-wall paper sack. This new method was less expensive for them to produce and more effective in protecting the contents inside. But some production of feed sack and flour sack fabric did continue up through the early 1960s. Many of the dress pattern companies took advantage of this cotton bag material, designing patterns where the pattern pieces would fit the dimensions of the bags. Most dresses designed to be made from cotton bags had waist seams so that they could be constructed in 2 main sections. In an attempt to slow the change away from patterned cotton bags, the National Cotton Council began to sponsor exciting contests in every state in the country to encourage women to become the National Cotton Bag Sewing Queen. Contests took place at state fairs and were advertised along with pattern booklet giveaways in rural magazines like Farm Journal. Regionally, the prizes included expensive sewing machines and even automobiles, with the chance to move on to the national competition and win trips to Hollywood, complete with movie studio tours and shopping sprees. So around the internet now, you can see some samples of vintage flour sack dresses that certainly don't look like Depression-era styles, such as this contest winner from 1956. But eventually, the inevitable end came, and all those flowery print feed and flour sacks disappeared from the feed stores and general stores. The heyday of cotton bag clothing is long gone now, but once upon a time, in a 1946 issue of Time magazine, a manager from Pillsbury Flour had this to say in an interview. They used to say that when the wind blew across the South, you could see our trade name on all the girls' underpants. So as a fitting end to our trip down this memory lane, here is a recitation of a famous poem about that faraway time. When I was a maiden fair, Mama made our underwear. With several tots and Pa's poor pay, how could she buy us lingerie? Monograms and fancy stitches were not on our flour sack breeches, just panty waists that stood the test, gold medal seal upon the chest. Little pants were best of all, with the scene I still recall. Harvesters were gleaning wheat right across the little seat. Tougher than a grizzly bear was our flour sack underwear, plain or fancy, 3 feet wide, stronger than a hippo's hide. Through the years, each Jill and Jack wore this sturdy garb of sack. Waste not, want not, we soon learned. Penny saved, penny earned. Bedspreads, curtains, tea towels too. The tablecloths were all reused. But the best, beyond compare, was our flour sack underwear.